In the scorching heat of a September morning in 490 BCE, two armies faced each other across a narrow plain beside the Aegean Sea. On one side stood the mightiest military machine the world had ever witnessed, a force so vast that ancient chroniclers claimed it could drink rivers dry and darken the sky with arrows. On the other side, barely 10,000 Greek warriors from Athens and their Plataean allies, armed with bronze shields and iron spears, prepared to make what seemed like the ultimate last stand. This wasn't just another border skirmish or territorial dispute. This was the moment when the fate of Western civilization hung in the balance. The Persian Empire, stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of India, had set its sights on the fractured city-states of Greece. Their message was simple: submit or be destroyed. But on the fields of Marathon, something extraordinary was about to unfold, a battle so shocking in its outcome that it would echo through history for over 2,000 years. The story begins not with the clash of bronze and steel, but in the marble halls of Persepolis, where King Darius I sat upon a throne that commanded the largest empire the world had ever known. His dominion stretched across 3 continents, his armies had never known defeat, and his treasury overflowed with the tribute of 100 conquered nations. Yet this mighty king nursed a burning obsession with a collection of small, quarrelsome Greek cities that dared to defy his will. The seeds of Marathon were planted years earlier, when the Greek cities of Ionia, along the coast of modern-day Turkey, rose in rebellion against Persian rule. It should have been a minor provincial uprising, easily crushed by imperial forces, but then something unprecedented happened. Athens and Eretria, 2 cities from mainland Greece, sent ships and soldiers to aid their Ionian cousins. The revolt was eventually crushed at the Battle of Lade in 494 BCE, but Darius never forgot this insult. How dare these insignificant Greek cities interfere with Persian affairs? How dare they support rebellion against the King of Kings? Darius began planning his revenge with the methodical precision that had built his empire. In 491 BCE, he sent envoys across Greece demanding earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission to Persian rule. Most of the smaller Greek cities complied, terrified by the prospect of Persian wrath. But Athens and Sparta gave a reply that shocked the ancient world. They threw the Persian ambassadors into pits, a gesture so outrageous that it guaranteed war. The die was cast. The Persian war machine began to turn its attention westward. The force that Darius assembled for his Greek expedition was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Ancient sources speak of armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, though modern historians suggest more conservative figures of perhaps 20 to 25,000 fighting men. Even at these reduced estimates, the Persian force was a multinational war machine drawn from across the known world. There were Persian immortals in their distinctive pell with their recurved bows, sated tunics and fish-scale armor, Median cavalryaka archers from the steppes, and Phoenician marines who had mastered the art of amphibious warfare. Command of this expedition fell to 2 of Darius's most trusted generals. Artaphernes, the king's own nephew, brought years of experience fighting rebellious provinces. Beside him stood Datis, a Median noble whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had earned him the king's confidence. Together, they commanded not just an army, but a floating city. 600 triremes, the cutting-edge warships of their day, carried this force across the wine-dark waters of the Aegean. Their strategy was elegant in its simplicity. First, they would subjugate the Cycladic islands, bringing these strategic stepping stones under Persian control. Then they would make an example of Eretria, the first city to aid the Ionian revolt. Finally, they would march on Athens, crush its upstart democracy, and install Hippias, the exiled Athenian tyrant who had fled to the Persian court years earlier. It was to be a campaign of punishment, a demonstration to all of Greece that defying the great king carried a terrible price. The Persian fleet moved through the Aegean like a plague of locusts. Island after island submitted without a fight, their populations awed by the size of the invasion force. When they reached Eretria, the city's defenders put up a brave fight, but after 6 days of siege, treachery opened the gates. The Persians sacked the city, enslaved its population, and burned its temples to ash. The message was clear: this would be the fate of any city that dared resist Persian might. With Eretria reduced to smoking ruins, the Persian commanders turned their attention to their ultimate prize, Athens. But where to land their massive force? The choice fell upon a broad plain beside the town of Marathon, 26 miles northeast of Athens. It was perfect for their needs. The wide, flat ground would allow their cavalry to deploy effectively, and the bay provided excellent anchorage for their fleet. There was even symbolic significance to the choice. It was here, decades earlier, that Hippias's father had once landed to seize power in Athens, but as the Persian ships beached on the shores of Marathon Bay and their soldiers began to disembark, urgent messengers were already racing south toward Athens. The city that had dared to defy the great king was about to face its greatest test. In Athens, the news struck like a thunderbolt. The Persians had landed. Eretria was destroyed. The enemy was barely a day's march from the city walls. In the agora, citizens gathered in tight knots, their faces grim with the knowledge that their defiance of Darius had brought this catastrophe upon them. Some whispered that they should have submitted when they had the chance. Others spoke of fleeing to the mountains or seeking refuge in distant colonies. But then the voice of Miltiades cut through the panic like a sword through silk. Miltiades was no ordinary Athenian general. Years earlier, he had served under Darius himself during the Persian campaign in Scythia. He had seen the Persian war machine from the inside, studied its strengths and weaknesses, and understood its tactics better than any man in Greece. When he spoke, the assembly listened. Athens would not flee. Athens would not submit. Athens would fight. The decision was not unanimous. Among the 10 generals who commanded the Athenian forces, opinion was sharply divided. Some argued for a defensive strategy, waiting behind the city's walls for Spartan reinforcements. Others wanted to negotiate, perhaps offering tribute in exchange for autonomy. But Miltiades and his supporters pressed for the boldest option of all. They would march to Marathon and face the Persians in open battle. The debate raged for hours until finally, the deciding vote came down to Callimachus, the polemarch, Athens' chief military officer. This was democracy in its rawest form. A handful of men making a decision that would determine the fate of their civilization. Callimachus cast his lot with Miltiades. Athens would march to war. Within hours, the city transformed into a hive of military activity. From every deme and district, the hoplites gathered. These were not professional soldiers, but citizen warriors, shopkeepers and farmers who had trained since boyhood in the art of war. They came carrying the bronze-faced shields that had been passed down through their families, wearing the linen corselets their wives had woven, gripping the ash-wood spears their fathers had wielded. 9,000 strong, they represented the flower of Athenian manhood. As the Athenian army prepared to march, a lone figure raced northward along the dusty mountain paths towards Sparta. Phidippides, Athens' finest long-distance runner, carried with him the most crucial message of his life. His mission was desperate, almost impossible. Cover the 150 miles to Sparta in 2 days and convince the warrior city to send aid. Every stride he took carried the hopes of his people. Every breath burned with the urgency of his task. But even as Phidippides pushed his body to its limits, both armies knew that help might come too late. The Spartans were celebrating the Carneia, their sacred festival to Apollo, and religious law forbade them from marching to war until the moon was full. The Athenians would have to face this trial alone, save for one small beacon of hope. Word had reached the tiny city of Plataea, Athens' faithful ally, and 1,000 Plataean warriors were already marching south to join their friends. The Athenian force that assembled in the pre-dawn darkness was a sight to stir the hearts of poets. These men were the embodiment of the Greek ideal, citizens who had chosen freedom over servitude, democracy over tyranny. They wore no uniform armor, carried no standard weapons. Some bore shields inherited from grandfathers who had fought the tyrants. Others carried spears forged just days before. What united them was not equipment, but purpose. They were fighting not for conquest or glory, but for the right to govern themselves. At their head rode Miltiades, his weathered face grim with determination. He had spent the night poring over reports from Marathon, studying the terrain, calculating odds that seemed impossible to overcome. The Persians outnumbered his force by more than 2 to 1. They possessed cavalry, those dreaded horsemen who could shatter infantry lines with thundering charges. Their archers could darken the sky with arrows, raining death from distances where Greek spears could not reach. By every measure of military science, the coming battle should be a massacre. Yet Miltiades saw something his fellow generals missed. The Persians had chosen their battlefield for its advantages, but every advantage could become a weakness if exploited correctly. The wide plain of Marathon was indeed perfect for cavalry, but it was bounded by marshes on one side and steep hills on the other. If the Greeks could control the terrain, they might neutralize the Persian mounted troops. The flat ground that seemed so favorable to their enemies could become a killing field if approached with the right tactics. As the sun climbed higher, the two armies came within sight of each other across the narrow plain. The contrast was stark and intimidating. The Persian host spread across the landscape like a glittering sea, their colorful banners snapping in the morning breeze. Median cavalry wheeled and pranced on the flanks, their horses' hooves raising clouds of dust. In the center, rank upon rank of infantry stood in perfect formation, their shields and spear points catching the sunlight like scattered jewels. The Greeks formed up in a much more modest display. Their bronze-faced shields created a wall of burnished metal, but their line seemed pitifully thin compared to the Persian host. Some of the younger hoplites felt their courage waver as they gazed upon their enemies. Never before had a Greek army faced such numbers in open battle. Never before had so much depended on so few. For 4 days, the armies faced each other in a deadly game of patience. Neither commander wanted to make the first move. The Persians expected the Greeks to attack first, allowing them to blunt the assault with arrows before unleashing their cavalry. The Greeks hoped to hold their position until Spartan reinforcements arrived. But with each passing hour, the psychological pressure mounted. Soldiers on both sides sharpened weapons that were already razor-sharp, checked armor that had been inspected a dozen times, and tried to read the future in the flight of birds overhead. It was during these tense days of waiting that Miltiades refined the battle plan that would change history. He had noticed something crucial about the Persian deployment. Their best troops, the Persians and Sakai, held the center of their line. The flanks were composed of less reliable allies and subject peoples who might break if pressed hard enough. Here was the key to victory, if he had the courage to use it. The plan he devised was audacious beyond belief. He would deliberately weaken his own center, stretching his line to match the Persian frontage while concentrating his strength on the wings. When battle was joined, he would allow his center to bend, perhaps even break, while his reinforced flanks crashed into the Persian wings. If his timing was perfect, if his men held their nerve, the Persian flanks would crumble, and his victorious wings could wheel inward to surround the enemy center. It was a strategy that violated every principle of Greek warfare. For generations, hoplite armies had fought with deep, solid formations designed to smash through enemy lines by sheer weight and momentum. What Miltiades proposed was the opposite, a calculated risk that could either win the battle or destroy his army in the attempt. When he explained the plan to his fellow generals, some thought he had lost his mind. Others saw the desperate genius behind the madness. The decision came on the 5th day, when Persian cavalry was spotted leaving the battlefield. Whether they had been recalled for some other mission or were simply watering their horses, their absence created the opportunity Miltiades had been waiting for. Without their mounted arm, the Persians would have to fight as infantry, neutralizing one of their greatest advantages. It was now or never. The Greek battle cry echoed across the plain as 10,000 voices roared their defiance at the Persian host. The sound sent chills down the spines of hardened Persian veterans who had conquered half the known world. Never before had they faced an enemy that seemed so eager for battle, so contemptuous of overwhelming odds. As the Greek phalanx began its advance, Persian archers nocked their arrows and prepared to unleash the storm that had broken so many enemy armies. But something unprecedented was happening. The Greeks were not walking into battle as armies had done for centuries. They were running. The sight was so shocking that Persian commanders stared in disbelief. Surely these madmen would arrive at the Persian lines exhausted and disorganized, easy prey for disciplined troops. Yet the phalanx held together as it charged, bronze shields locked, spear points lowered, their war cry growing louder with each stride. The arrows came in black clouds, hissing through the air like deadly rain. Shields sprouted feathers like hedgehogs. Men stumbled and fell, but the charge never faltered. The Greeks had learned from bitter experience that the only way to survive an arrow storm was to get through it as quickly as possible. Better to risk exhaustion than to stand still and be shot to pieces. When the lines finally met, the collision shook the earth itself. The crash of bronze on bronze echoed like thunder across the plain as 10,000 Greeks slammed into the Persian line. Spear points found gaps in armor, shields splintered under the weight of the charge, and men screamed as they grappled in the deadly embrace of close combat. The Persian front ranks, caught off guard by the speed of the Greek assault, staggered backward under the impact. Exactly as Miltiades had predicted, the battle unfolded in 3 distinct phases. On the Greek right wing, the tribe of Ajax pressed forward with relentless fury, their bronze spears punching through Persian shields like paper. The Persians on this flank, mostly conscripted troops from subject nations, had little stomach for this kind of brutal hand-to-hand combat. Within minutes, their line began to buckle and break. On the left wing, the Plataeans fought with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland. Though outnumbered, they knew that defeat meant the destruction of their city and the enslavement of their families. Their captain Arimnestos led from the front, his sword dripping with Persian blood as he carved a path through enemy ranks. The Persian left flank, already shaken by the ferocity of the assault, began to crumble. But in the center, disaster was unfolding exactly as Miltiades had planned. The thin Greek line, only 4 ranks deep in steer Persian pressure, the elite Persian immortals and of the usual 8, bent like a bow under their Sakai allies, pushed forward with disciplined precision, their longer spears finding Greek flesh, their arrows creating gaps in the phalanx. Step by step, the Athenian center gave ground. To the Persian commanders watching from their elevated position, victory seemed assured. Their best troops were breaking through the Greek line, splitting the enemy army in 2. Soon they would be in the Greek rear, and the battle would become a rout. But they had not counted on the iron discipline of the Athenian hoplites or the tactical genius of their general. The men in the Greek center, led by the future statesman Aristides and the young Themistocles, fought with grim determination even as they retreated. They knew their role in Miltiades' plan. They were the anvil upon which the battle would be decided. Every step they yielded, every life they sacrificed, was buying time for the wings to complete their work. Then came the moment that would be remembered for centuries. As the Persian center pressed forward in pursuit of the retreating Greeks, they suddenly found themselves isolated. The collapse of their flanks had created a deadly trap. The victorious Greek wings, having routed their opponents, now turned inward like the closing jaws of a great beast. The Persians in the center suddenly realized their peril. Behind them, their own fleeing troops blocked any retreat. To their left and right, Greek spearmen were closing in, their bronze-tipped weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. Ahead of them, the supposedly broken Greek center had stopped retreating and was forming up for a counterattack. They were surrounded. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter. Trapped in the killing ground of their own making, the Persian center collapsed into chaos. Warriors who had conquered Egypt and Babylon found themselves pressed so tightly together they could barely lift their weapons. The Greek pincers closed with merciless efficiency, bronze spears finding Persian flesh from 3 sides at once. 6,400 Persian dead would litter the field before the sun set, while the Greeks lost only 192 men. The survivors fled to their ships in panic, abandoning weapons, banners, and wounded comrades in their desperate flight to the sea. But even there, Miltiades gave them no respite. Understanding that the Persian fleet might sail around Cape Sunion to attack Athens directly, he force-marched his exhausted warriors back to the city in a single day. When the Persian ships appeared off the coast of Phaleron, they found the same bronze shields that had defeated them at Marathon waiting on the shore. The Persian dream of conquering Greece died on the fields of Marathon. More than that, the impossible victory proved that the mightiest empire on earth could bleed, could be beaten by free men fighting for their homeland. The shockwaves of this single battle would ripple across centuries, inspiring the golden age of Athens, the rise of democracy, and the flowering of philosophy and art that still shapes our world today. Marathon was more than a military victory. It was proof that courage, intelligence, and the unbreakable will to be free could triumph over any odds. In an age when empires seemed invincible and individual cities powerless, 10,000 Greeks showed the world that sometimes, just sometimes, David really can slay Goliath.